the IATF 16949 podcast, where we talk about all things automotive. Find us on our channel at youtube.com/IATF 16949 auditing, or visit our website at www.iatfglobaloversight.org. This is the IATF 16949 podcast.
I think the next topic is going to be one that I know we have personally got quite a few questions about, and that is remote auditing.
Yeah.
Is remote auditing allowed now?
Well, the quick answer is it's probably not a quick answer, is it? But in certain situations, remote auditing is allowed. And again, it's the first time that we've seen this. Obviously, with COVID, IATF did permit remote auditing, again, under certain conditions. But this is the first time we've seen it included in the scheme rules. So that in itself, I think, is a great step forward. There's no doubt, is there, Devin, that we know, and I would say the IATF see that it's really, on-site audits are the most effective audits. Our scheme is all around the manufacturing of products, and I don't think anyone's in any doubt that to audit a manufacturing organization, and particularly manufacturing processes, you really need to be there, and that remains in Rule 6. So whilst remote auditing has been introduced in certain circumstances, it's not it's not going to kind of take over from the traditional on-site audit, which is very much still required by the IATF, particularly in the manufacturing sites. But two things I'd say around remote auditing. One, because of COVID, many of us all work in slightly different ways. We might not be working from our workplace, our factory or our office 5 days a week in the way that we might have been doing pre-COVID. So that's acknowledged in the rules. So it's absolutely possible during an on-site audit for people to be brought into that audit using remote technology. But again, the key point there is the auditor is on site, but they are bringing people who either are not based in the office or are not in the office on the day of the audit. They're bringing them in using remote auditing methodology. But I think the other thing where remote auditing is permitted is to audit what we call standalone remote support locations. So again, this is a term that we introduced under Rules 5th. The standalone remote support location is essentially an office type environment. It's activity that's happening in an office or in a facility that is not IATF certified, which again is, when we think of a standalone remote support location, we think very much of an office on its own. And depending what's going on in that office, they would be eligible to go through a remote audit. Again, in Rule 6, there's a whole list. It's Annex 2 towards the back of Rule 6 of activities that could be carried out in these support locations. So things like purchasing, logistics, marketing, sales. So there's a whole product design. There's a whole series of potential activities that could happen at these standalone remote support locations. They're somehow supporting one or more manufacturing sites. And then Annex 2 basically says, if I'm doing that, is it eligible that I audit them remotely? And if I look at just purchasing, for example, if that's what's happening in the standalone remote support location, they are eligible to be audited remotely. Sales, exactly the same, eligible for remote audit. So that means the certification body doesn't have to physically travel to that standalone remote support location, but instead they can audit them remotely. I think the other, just while we're on this subject, is the frequency. So for a standalone remote support location, they're audited if they're not doing product design or, let's say, product handling activities. They're audited once every 24 months, so once every 2 years. And what we say in Rule 6 is the audit can be, if they're eligible to be audited remotely, then they go through a remote audit. What the rules does say is the next audit, which in the case of a sales or a purchasing office will be 2 years later, that does need to be on site. So you can't never go on site, but there is some flexibility to allow remote auditing.
Remote auditing is allowed in very limited use for remote support locations, only once every 2 years.
Yeah.
Or once every
other audit. Yeah.
Every other audit. So
yeah.
Realistically, once every 4 years you can do a remote. And does it apply to any type of audit, or is it only surveillance, only research?
So that's you're opening up another can of worms here, because what the other difference with standalone remote support locations, and again, this is a big change. What we're saying with Rule 6 is they kind of go through the initial audit, but from there on in, they just go through a never-ending series of surveillance audits. So the concept of a traditional audit cycle of initial surveillance research at a standalone remote support location no longer exists. What we've got is a regular surveillance audit happening at those standalone remote support locations, and it's that regular surveillance audit that would be used to make a certificate decision for the site that standalone remote support location is supporting.
Yeah, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. We'll get to them. I know it's more of a complicated subject, but just to try to sum up, Niall, standalone remote support locations are once certified just on a surveillance only cycle every other year, which every 4 years you can do a virtual or a remote audit at.
Devin, just to be clear, the surveillance audit frequency at the standalone does depend on what they do. So if they do product design, if they do product handling, then they are going to be on an annual surveillance. But if they are doing activities like purchasing, sales, then it's once every 2 years. So the surveillance cycle is once every 2 years for those organizations. Again, Annex 2 then also goes on to say whether or not a remote audit is allowed, because not only does the audit frequency depend on what's happening at that standalone remote support location, but the eligibility for them to go through a remote audit also depends on what they do. So again, as you say, there's lots of detail around this that we will probably have to revisit on a subsequent event once we've seen all the questions coming in.
We can make our one podcast dedicated to just this subject, I'm pretty sure. To Niall's point, go to Annex 2 for reference. It's tried to describe it as in detail as possible, but we know there'll probably be more questions, so drop them in the chat. we'll try to answer all the questions, and then wait for perhaps another podcast.
Yeah.
All right, Niall. You want to move on to decertification process? I believe there was some updates
Yeah.
from Rules 5th to Rule 6th around the decertification process.
Yeah, that is true. Again, this is, I would say, has been simplified, because again, under Rules 5th, we had a number of entry points into the decertification process. Things like a surveillance audit not being conducted on time. And we mentioned at the beginning of this event that that has come out of the decert process, and the window for undertaking that surveillance audit has been expanded. So there are fewer events that initiate the decertification process. In fact, there are two. One of them is a performance complaint that is issued in the IATF complaint management system against a certified organisation. That would be a trigger to initiate the decertification process. The second and probably more common trigger is the date of a closing meeting of either a surveillance recertification or a special audit that contains non-conformities. That's the start point, and then the process itself is again, there's a 15-day deadline for the certification body to analyse the situation, be it in the event of a performance complaint or non-conformities being raised. And the certification body will decide, again, the certification decision function within the certification body will decide whether or not to suspend the certificate. Now, we know that if a major non-conformity has been raised, that will almost force the suspension process. But in the case of minor non-conformities, the organisation still enters into the decertification process, but depending on the number and severity of those minor non-conformities, it's likely that they come out of it at that 15-day point where a decision is made whether to suspend or not suspend. And then the next step in the decertification process happens at 90 days, again, be it for a performance complaint or a non-conformities raised, and an on-site special audit is undertaken to determine whether or not effective corrective action has been applied. And again, coming out of that special audit, the auditor will make a recommendation to the certification decision function to either reinstate the certificate or to withdraw the certificate. And then the certification decision function has a bit of time, up to 120 days, to make the final certificate decision.
Yeah. Thank you, Niall. And I want to touch on one thing because it may be confusing. And you said at the closing meeting date of surveillance, which I think people are used to, recertification people are used to, and then you said special audits. I don't know if all clients are used to having non-conformities written at a special audit. So can you kind of touch on that real quick?
Yeah. So normally, to be honest, you wouldn't. Again, it depends what the reason for the special audit is. So you're right, Devin. In most cases, you would not expect non-conformities to be raised during a special audit, particularly where the special audit is there to assess the effective implementation of corrective actions from previous non-conformities. So the scope of the special audit in that case is very well focused, and absolutely you would not expect non-conformities to be raised there. the output from that event is a certificate recommendation to either reinstate or withdraw. But there are other reasons for doing special audits, expansion of scope, changes within the quality management system that could result in non-conformities. But so, yeah, you're right to raise that. That's an important point. Most special audits to verify implementation of non-conformities would not result in new non-conformities. But there will be other reasons. There's a whole list of reasons for doing special audits that could result in non-conformities. And I guess, Devon, we can't help on this subject but mention the concept introduced back in Rules 5th, I think, which was the sometimes known as the 2 for 1. So if a minor non-conformity hasn't been effectively implemented, then the certification body, the auditor, is obliged to raise 2 major non-conformities. So again, in that case, it's possible that major non-conformities could be raised during a special audit if the special audit is verifying the effective implementation of minor non-conformities as well as major.
The IATF 16949 podcast, where we talk about all things automotive. Find us on our channel at youtube.com/IATF 16949 auditing, or visit our website at www.iatfglobaloversight.org. This is the IATF 16949 podcast.